They laughed when the crate arrived, because in a camp full of standardized issue rifles and men trained to respect uniformity, anything that came through the post felt like a joke. A civilian purchase turned soldierly necessity into a punchline, and the laughter followed him as he pried the lid loose, revealing a long, plain rifle with none of the marks of a government arsenal. No stamps of acceptance, no history etched into steel. Only a receipt folded in the oilcloth and a promise written by a distant manufacturer that accuracy could be delivered to anyone willing to pay and wait. The rifle looked ordinary, even modest, and that was the worst crime of all, because war had a way of worshipping pedigree, and anyone who did not carry the same medal as the others was suspect. The jokes came easily. Mail-order hero, bargain bin marksman, catalog killer. And he accepted them with a quiet nod, because he had learned early that arguing only sharpened the blade aimed at your back. Patience in fields and on ranges that were not official, and his hands knew the language of triggers and wind long before an officer ever tested him. He cleaned the rifle carefully, not to prove anything, but to learn it. The weight, the balance, the way the bolts sang when worked slowly, the way it whispered when rushed. He took it apart and put it together until the metal felt like an extension of his thoughts. And when the first live fire exercise came and the paper targets were set at distances meant to humble, he did not perform for the crowd. He shot the way he always had, breathing measured, letting the sight settle, trusting the rifle to be what it was rather than what it was said to be. The holes clustered close enough that the instructor paused and then said nothing at all. And silence in a place of noise is louder than laughter. Word moved anyway, because war camps are rumor engines, and a man who did not boast but produced results was more interesting than a man who bragged and missed. The jokes did not stop, because tradition is stubborn and respect is rationed like ammunition. They were shipped out into terrain that chewed plans into scraps and spat them back as guesses, and the air was heavy with heat and insects and the knowledge that unseen eyes measured every movement. The enemy snipers were already a story before they were a threat. Men spoke of shots that came from nowhere and found throats or helmets at impossible angles, and patrols slowed and then slowed again, fear narrowing the world to the length of a breath. In that place, the man with the mail-order rifle found his quiet, because quiet is where skill lives. He observed not with drama, but with attention, learning the rhythm of the land, how birds lifted when disturbed, how leaves stilled when nothing moved, how the sun cut shadows that lied in the morning and told the truth by afternoon. The first encounter came without ceremony, a crack in the distance, a man down, and the instinct to scatter fought the training to freeze. He did not move. Instead, he watched the space where the sound had come from, not looking for a person, but for a mistake. And there it was, a glint that should not have been there at that hour, a shape too regular to be rock. He did not rush the shot. He did not think of the laughter or the crate or the receipt. He thought of wind and distance and the small correction that made the difference. And when he pressed the trigger, the rifle answered clean, and the shape was gone. There was no cheer, because the jungle swallowed sound, and because the weight of what had happened settled slowly, like dust after a collapse. The count that would later be told began there, but at the time, there was only relief and a deeper focus. The next day stretched and folded into each other. Patrols became careful advances, advances became stillness, and stillness became opportunity. The enemy snipers were skilled, disciplined, and confidence leaves patterns. He learned theirs. Trees, certain angles, certain times after rain. He learned how they tested positions with decoys and how they trusted those tests, perhaps too much. He countered not by bravado, but by subtraction, removing options, closing lanes, forcing them to choose between worse choices. And when they chose, he was ready. The rifle did not fail him because he did not ask it to be more than it was. He maintained it religiously, keeping it dry, keeping it true, keeping himself honest about its limits. The others stopped laughing, somewhere between the second and third confirmed kill. But respect is shy, and came sideways. Men began to ask questions, quietly at first, about his setup, his ammunition, his method, and he answered what he could without turning it into a performance, because instruction given as theater becomes myth, and myth kills when copied badly. By the end of the second day, the jungle seemed to listen back as if acknowledging a change. The enemy fire thinned, then sharpened, then thinned again. For the hand that had disrupted their dominance, and he anticipated that too, shifting positions, refusing to be fixed, using the terrain like punctuation marks to break the sentence of pursuit. He was not hunting individuals, so much as dismantling a system, a network of eyes and shots that relied on predictability. And when that predictability cracked, the fear shifted sides. The fourth day dawned heavy and close, and the radio traffic hinted at pressure elsewhere, a chance that would not last. He moved before light, selecting a vantage that offered patience rather than glory, and waited as the sun climbed and the jungle woke. He counted breaths and seconds, and the slow slide of sweat. And when the first silhouette appeared where it should not have been, he took it, and then another, as the system tried to reassert itself. Each shot measured, each movement planned, and when it was over, the tally that would be repeated later with awe was simply a number attached to faces he did not. Celebrate the rifle lay across his knees, warm and familiar and ordinary as ever. When they moved out, the jokes were gone, replaced by a careful deference that felt heavier than laughter, because it carried expectation. And expectation is a burden. He carried it anyway, because war does not ask what you prefer, only what you can do. And for 4 days, he had done what he could with a rifle that arrived by mail and a discipline that arrived by years. And when the story spread beyond the unit, it grew, because stories always do. But the core remained simple. A man trusted his skill over opinion, and a tool judged by its work rather than its origin. And in a place where origins were often erased by necessity, that lesson mattered as much as any victory. And when later someone asked him about the laughter, he shrugged, because memory softens edges, and because the rifle never cared what anyone thought. It only cared that the hand behind it was steady, and the eye honest, and the moment respected. Enough.
After those 4 days, the unit did not return to normal, because nothing ever truly resets after a pattern is broken. The jungle kept its heat and insects, and the routines returned on paper, but the men carried a new awareness that skill could arrive from unexpected places, and that the loudest confidence was often the weakest armor. He was not celebrated in formation, and no medals were pinned in that moment, because the war had other priorities. But his name moved through whispers, and those whispers shaped behavior. Patrol leaders adjusted routes based on his observations. Sentries trusted pauses rather than speed, and the habit of rushing into contact softened into something more deliberate. He continued his work without theatrics, mapping terrain, noting lines of sight, teaching others how to read the land without turning lessons into commandments. He emphasized patience and humility, because both survive longer than bravado, and because the jungle punished certainty more harshly than ignorance. The rifle remained unchanged, a simple tool cleaned at the same hour every day, checked with the same care, and stored without ceremony. It did not become a talisman or a symbol, because symbols attract expectations, and expectations attract mistakes. Supply officers looked at it with curiosity once, and then moved on, because bureaucracy does not have time for exceptions. The enemy adapted too, because adaptation is the tax of survival. Their shots came less frequently, but from more complex angles, and decoys improved, and movement became subtler. He welcomed that, because complexity reveals seams, and seams can be studied. He adjusted his approach, spending longer in observation, changing elevation rather than distance, shifting position by meters instead of kilometers, and sometimes choosing not to shoot at all, because restraint is a weapon that rarely misfires. There were days when nothing happened, and those days were victories that no one counted, because absence does not photograph well that night. Conversations turned quieter and more thoughtful. Men spoke of home less as escape and more as anchor. He listened more than he spoke, because listening collects patterns, and patterns inform choices. And when asked about the mail order label, he smiled thinly and said only that accuracy does not know how it arrives, only where it is needed. The pressure of expectation never left, but he learned to distribute it, sharing techniques, crediting teamwork, refusing to let a single narrative harden around him, because hardened narratives break and cut everyone nearby. He insisted that success came from many hands, from spotters, from the trolls that moved correctly, from commanders who allowed patience, and from the environment itself, which offered clues to those willing to learn. The days stretched, and the weeks folded, and the tally did not repeat, because it never needed to. The system had changed, and change persisted longer than numbers. When the unit rotated, he packed the rifle with the same care he had unpacked it months before. No ceremony, no speeches, just oilcloth and quiet, and the long wait for transport. Later in another place, with different terrain and different enemies, the laughter never returned, because memory teaches selectively, and those who had been there taught the newcomers how to watch and how to wait, and how to judge tools by outcomes rather than origins. Years later, when stories were told, they simplified, as stories do, turning patience into drama and quiet into legend. But the man himself resisted that version, because legends flatten nuance, and nuance was the lesson worth keeping. That skill is grown, not issued. That respect is earned, not stamped. And that a calm mind, paired with an honest tool, can tilt the balance without announcing itself. And if anyone asked what mattered most, he said consistency. Because consistency makes luck look like planning. And when he finally set the rifle aside, it was not because it failed, but because its work was done. And that was the only measure he ever trusted. Time passed in a way that only war understands, measured not by calendars, but by rotations, names of places that blur together, and the gradual lightening or hardening of men's eyes. He moved on with another unit into terrain that traded jungle density for broken hills and scrub, where wind replaced insects as the constant companion. And distances stretched perception until targets looked closer than they were and farther than they felt. The rifle traveled with him, wrapped plain and unremarkable, and the mail-order joke no longer followed, because stories outrun labels and arrive first, shaping expectation before reality can speak. In these hills, the enemy used elevation and patience, favoring long waits and single shots meant to wound morale more than bodies. And the unit felt that pressure early, losing time and confidence in equal measure. He returned to fundamentals, because fundamentals outlast environments. Observation, route discipline, timing, the careful selection of positions that allowed retreat without haste. He spent hours doing nothing, because doing nothing well is an acquired skill. And when he did move, it was with purpose that minimized signature and maximized options. The others watched and learned, because competence invites imitation more reliably than command. And soon the unit's behavior shifted again, becoming quieter, slower, more deliberate. The rifle continued to perform, not because it was special, but because it was understood, and understanding removes surprises. He documented wind patterns at different times, learned how sound carried across stone, how dust betrayed movement, how heat shimmer lied and told the truth in alternating layers. He shared this knowledge freely, because hoarded skill rots, and because survival improves when information circulates. The enemy tested them, probing with feints and false retreats, and he answered not with pursuit, but with denial, closing lanes, refusing to be drawn out, forcing engagement on terms that favored clarity over chaos. Shots were taken. They were taken cleanly and sparingly, because restraint preserves options, and options preserve life. The unit's confidence rebuilt not as swagger, but as trust. Trust in process, trust in each other, trust that patience would be rewarded. Even when nothing seemed to happen, the rifle remained clean and plain and uncelebrated. And that was fitting, because tools are meant to disappear into function, not demand attention. Eventually orders came that shifted priorities and pulled them away from those hills. And as they packed, there was a moment when someone asked if he would ever trade the rifle for something newer, something with a pedigree. And he considered the question seriously, because consideration honors curiosity. And he answered that he would trade when there was a reason, and that reasons should be specific, not fashionable. That answer stayed with the asker longer than a brand name would have. When the war finally loosened its grip, and he returned to places where silence was not tactical, but ordinary, he found that the habits remained. Waking early, scanning horizons, choosing patience over impulse. The rifle went into storage, not as a relic, but as a record of work done honestly. He did not seek interviews or recount tallies, because numbers invite comparison, and comparison distorts purpose. When asked privately what he thought about the story that had grown around him, he said that stories are scaffolding, useful for reaching understanding, but dangerous if mistaken for the building itself. He preferred to talk about preparation, about learning to read environments, about the humility required to accept limits, and the discipline required to operate within them. He spoke about tools too, emphasizing maintenance, familiarity, and realistic expectations, because disappointment often begins where fantasy ends, and fantasy thrives on labels rather than results. Years later, someone would open a crate somewhere and hear laughter at something that did not fit expectation. Would remember that effectiveness does not announce its origin, and that quiet competence can arrive by ordinary means. And in that sense, the rifle continued its work long after it was set aside, because the lesson traveled lighter than any piece of equipment and needed no shipping label at all.